when people say, oh, I feel like I'm not doing RDLs properly because my lower back really hurts. Good. It should hurt because your lower back is partly responsible for that movement. Sadly, when people think about lower back hurting, they automatically jump to an injury. They're like, oh, my lower back hurts, I must have injured myself, because people are very, I think, sensitive and maybe cautious of lower back problems. Just because it's hurting doesn't mean that's negative. Just like me saying, oh, my biceps are hurting doing curls, I'm worried I've torn a bicep. The red eye has left us, which is obviously a positive, and today we're actually going to look at something slightly different. So we're going to look at Strong with Kelly, and we're going to look at her Ditch Your 3-Minute Abs and Train Your Core video as a great catalyst for conversation. Because although I do speak about like core training and ab training in videos, I kind of like intermittently throughout, I don't really ever elaborate on them. So we're going to kind of split this video into a few sections, actually giving more of a deep dive into core training using Kelly's video as an example, more so much the exercises she's showing rather than what she's saying. If throughout this entire video you actually just learn something from the video, I would really appreciate it if you did consider subscribing to the channel, as it does very much help the channel grow. And when the channel grows, we do better. When we do better, we're happier. And when we're happier, my eye's less red. I don't know. But again, only subscribe to the channel if you actually learn something. If you don't learn something, just ignore me and block me, because it's probably worth it. So the first thing I think we need to identify is when looking at core training, the first thing you will think about when thinking about the core is probably going to be your abdominal region, but that's not it. The abdominal region, so the abs, like the six-pack region and whatnot, is certainly an aspect of your core, but the core stems a bit beyond that. So you can consider multiple different areas as part of the core. The lower back muscles are part of your core. You can consider the obliques part of your core, the abdominal region part of your core, technically your hip flexors part of your core. There are, again, and more. There are multiple areas of the core that all contribute into effective core training. It's not just as simple as do a crunch and hope for the best. And the first section Kelly speaks about is actually kind of the basic one of core training, which is spinal flexion. As we can see here, this very much represents a movement in which you're doing like a crunch variation or a reverse crunch variation. The big thing we're trying to focus on here is going to be that abdominal region, being like six-pack muscle region, and the primary focus should be reducing the distance between your sternum and your pelvis, or your pelvis and your sternum. And to do that, we must flex a spine, which is that rounding of the spine where you're doing that crunch motion, because again, you are then reducing the distance between those points, thus contracting that region, so the abdominal region, through a relevant range of motion. And this is very much going to be what I would say is pretty fundamental when looking at actually targeting the six-pack abs, especially from like a developmental perspective, because I'm a big believer in, if you want to build your abs, which you may think you don't, but probably not a bad thing, you should treat them and train them like any other muscle. And when people argue that, I always ask for a justification as to why should you not train the abs as you would any other muscle group like the calves or biceps or whatever, and I rarely get given a good answer. And by rarely, I mean I never have. When it comes to like spinal flexion movements, my preferred ones will be like a decline crunch, a rope crunch, a hanging leg raise where you're getting the hips up as well, a reverse crunch, something along those lines, which, like I said, simply just focus on reducing the distance between those 2 points. Then we flip over to more of like the spinal extension realm, where we are looking at targeting a different aspect of the core, being primarily the lower back here. So again, you see Kelly is doing like this kind of like Superman, Cobra, whatever you want to call it. People are going to have different names for it, but she is doing this movement where she's essentially encouraging spinal flexion, where the lower back is essentially having to work to contract to then hold a certain position. Other movements that are really great for that are hip hinge variations too. So you've got things like the RDL, the SLDL, arguably the deadlifts as well, although I'm not a massive fan of deadlifting myself from a hypertrophy perspective, but they do have other reasons and other uses. You also got things like the back extension, so hyperextension, reverse hyperextension, thus taking the relevant muscle group, so being the lower back muscles here, through that relevant range of motion. So again, when people say, oh, I feel like I'm not doing RDLs properly because my lower back really hurts. Good. It should hurt because your lower back is partly responsible for that movement. And sadly, when people think about lower back hurting, they automatically jump to an injury. They're like, oh, my lower back hurts, I must have injured myself, because people are very, I think, sensitive and maybe cautious of lower back problems, which I do understand. I've had many back issues myself in my time. Just because it's hurting doesn't mean that's negative. Just like me saying, oh, my biceps are hurting doing curls, I'm worried I've torn a bicep. No, I'm working the relevant muscle group, therefore they're hurting because hopefully I'm working them effectively. Same thing applies with the deadlift or deadlift variations and hip hinge patterns, is that your lower back should hurt to an extent. Again, a good hurt, not a bad hurt. Separate between like working the muscle and injuring yourself, because you are working those muscles through those movements. So it is normal. Then we move on to another movement pattern, being lateral flexion here, which is essentially, again, flexing is bending essentially. Lateral flexion is to the side. So literally side bending would be lateral flexion. The obliques, for example, would be heavily incorporated doing movements like this, because this is one of their primary functions. The issue is with training the obliques, although I think obviously when looking at like building a stable and strong core, training all of the core is probably going to be a good thing. Some people have the concern that developing the obliques too much may give the appearance of a slightly thicker or wider waist, which for some people might go against their aesthetic goals. Again, like with any other muscle, when you build it, it gets thicker, it develops. Again, that could obviously happen with the obliques. Not a bad thing, especially when looking at injury prevention and building what people would define like a bulletproof core, but it may not necessarily align with aesthetic desires. So it really depends on what your goals are and what's most important to you right now. And then another function of the obliques, and actually technically two functions of the obliques here, is going to be rotation and anti-rotation. Rotation is commonly utilized when doing things like Kelly's about to do, like Russian twists, wood choppers, whatever you want to call movements where you are essentially using the obliques to rotate. And the big thing here is we don't want to worry too much about what the hands are doing. We want to make sure that trunk, so that core region, is rotating, not just the hands. Some people maintain that one torso line and just move their hands. You're not actually getting any rotation there, so that's a key thing. The other aspect of that people commonly neglect is going to be anti-rotation. Just like the obliques are primarily responsible for rotation, they're also responsible for resisting rotation. So what I mean by that, things like the pull-off press, things like the side plank potentially, movements that would encourage you to rotate, your obliques are going to actively have to fight against to prevent that rotation. And those anti-rotational movements can be really important for people who do, for example, do mixed grip deadlifts. So deadlifting is obviously a very grip demanding movement, and your grip is always going to be weaker than your deadlift muscles. Obviously you can use straps, you can hook grip and things like that, which is fine, but some people will opt for a mixed grip where you over-under. One hand underhand, one hand overhand. That's fine, but in doing so, that is over time going to encourage some slight rotation, which is why implementing anti-rotational movements like the pull-off press, for example, could be really beneficial at fighting those muscular imbalances that might develop through lots of mixed grip deadlifting, whilst also putting yourself in a position where your core is strong enough to better support you, thus hopefully helping prevent any injuries that may stem from rotational imbalances. But beyond that, core training doesn't need to be that complicated. Again, you have to identify what your goals are. If your goals are simply to develop your abdominal region for aesthetic purposes, then you'll probably find just doing things like a crunch or crunch variation and a reverse crunch variation or hanging leg raise, things that encourage a lot of spinal flexion. If you're more concerned about really putting yourself in a position where your body could probably be stable enough, strong enough, and resistant enough to a lot of the demands you may be placing on it, let's say especially if you're a power lifter, for example, then doing things that encourage either anti-rotation and spinal flexion, arguably lateral flexion, although that's probably not my key priority for a lot of people because it doesn't really align with a lot of like movement patterns powerlifters would do, for example. But things like that where you are targeting the core in different manners and in different ways is probably going to be quite beneficial when looking at preventing injuries from occurring, or like I said, just simply putting yourself in the strongest position to essentially provide your core with the most stability and resistance to anything that may be thrown its way. But the other thing to remember is more isn't necessarily better. One of the big contributing factors when it comes to injury is people doing too much volume, under recovery and over fatigue. That doesn't just apply to like your chest training, your leg training, that can also apply to your core training. You can only recover from so much volume, and doing more than you can recover from could put you in a position where you're more susceptible to injuries. Despite the training you're doing potentially ideally aiding in preventing injuries, it's still going to tax you, it's still going to warrant fatigue, and it's still going to require recovery. Too much of that could actually set you back. So just be wary with how much volume you're doing. And to be honest, if you're not really sure how much volume to do, I'll give you some options. Link down below, you've got a few things. You've got the link to apply to work with myself on a one-to-one coaching basis, so I can help coach you towards your goals online and actually show you how much volume you probably don't need to achieve your goals. You've also got the link to the tfnl group coaching, which you can do either at home or at the gym, and that costs less than $1 a day. Or if none of those tickle your pickle, you've also got the link to the TFNL workout guides, which again cover a range of things, be that gym workouts, home workouts, whatever tickles your pickle. There's probably an option for that link down below in the description. So have a gander if you're bored. But like with all my videos and all the things I preach online, it is simply my opinion. And again, just because it's my opinion doesn't necessarily mean it's the only opinion or necessarily the right opinion. It's simply mine, and you should do your research to form your own. But until the next one, thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my waffle about core training, and thank you for tolerating the video.